So, chapter one was all about the migration from Africa to the Americas. But what we never answered in question one when we learned about the first Americans was like, who were the first Americans? And so, we in chapter two used a vocabulary word, culture, to answer that question. Your culture is your way of life. So, what we did is we just kind of looked at the what life was like for these first Americans and we analyzed the cultures, and you did have a task at the end of chapter two. If you remember, you got an imaginary ticket to an imaginary time machine, and you had to pick the one culture out of the three that I introduced that you would want to go back and be a part of. And we used the changes in culture to answer that question, who were the first Americans? And so, if you remember, the first humans entered the Americas crossing Beringia about 12,000 years ago. And the culture, the way of life of these first humans, they were giant mammal hunters. That was what their way of life was all about. It was high risk, very dangerous, but lots of reward, 3 to 6 months worth of meat for every mammoth they killed. We're still living in an ice age, so it's very cold. We have this constant migration following our food, and our portable shelter allows for that constant migration and a very short life expectancy. But then, 10,000 years ago, at the end of the ice age, all of the giant mammals living in the Americas died out. Well, you can't be a giant mammal hunter if there aren't giant mammals to hunt. So humans were smart enough to realize, well, if my food's all gone, I better find new food if I don't want to die. And since the food was the basic nature of their culture, the entire culture changed. They went from giant mammal hunters to hunters and gatherers. We're now hunting smaller mammals and fish and birds, and we're gathering nuts and berries and plants. And so the risk has gone down to medium. We don't get a lot of reward. One hunt is very risky. You might not even get food that day, and killing a squirrel certainly isn't going to last 3 to 6 months for your band to eat. We're out of the ice age, so at normal temperatures, allowing for just a seasonal migration to go where the food is when the food is there. We're still using those portable shelters, and our life expectancy has gone up a little bit. But then, 7,000 years ago, humans figured out that when you plant a seed, a plant will grow. And so a new culture came about that is farming and agriculture. Low risk, as much reward as you want. We're still in these normal temperatures. Plants don't migrate, so we don't have to migrate anymore, allowing for permanent shelters and a little bit longer life expectancy. So, this new culture, farming and agriculture, migration had stopped. Homes are now permanent. People can grow more food so they can eat more and live longer, and their populations grew. And the smaller groups, the bands, came together and formed tribes. So I asked you, like, what do you think of when you hear the word tribe? And some of you said Native Americans, and others said Indians. We talked about the fact that while most people use those two words interchangeably, the only acceptable answer is going to be Native Americans. We cannot call them Indians. It's not mean, it's just wrong, which we'll talk about later. So, when you are asked the question, who were the first Americans? There's only one good answer. The only correct answer is Native Americans. And we choose to call these first Americans Native Americans. We chose that name for them because if you look up Native in the dictionary, it literally means first or original. So, by calling them Native Americans, we're literally calling them the first Americans or the original Americans. We cannot call them Indians. It's not mean, it's just wrong. And we can thank Christopher Columbus for accidentally getting us all to call them Indians. We did do a little bit of Columbus bashing when you were with me. We talked about what he's famous for. I mean, there's an entire holiday to celebrate Columbus. And when you first learned about Christopher Columbus in elementary school, you learned he's famous for discovering America. Except the word discover means to find for the very first time. You can't find something for the first time or somewhere for the very first time if people are already living there. And when Columbus, quote unquote, discovered America, he saw people living there. There were already Native Americans there. Was he the first person in the Americas? No. Did he even know he was in the Americas when he did get there? No. If you remember, he was trying to get to the Indies and he landed in the Americas instead and thought he was in the Indies. He didn't even know he was in the Americas all four times. So he wasn't the first person in the Americas. That was, of course, the first Americans or the Native Americans. And sadly enough, he wasn't even the second person in the Americas. That was, if you remember, the Vikings. Christopher Columbus didn't even come to the Americas until 500 years after the Vikings. Now, again, he was the third person in the Americas, but he never even knew he was there. He died still thinking he had made it to the Indies. So, we did take a detour and kind of threw in a chapter 2.5 to just learn some interesting things about the Vikings. And really, we talked about the fact that the only thing really truthful that archaeologists are really sure is true about the Vikings is that they really were experts at building and sailing ships. And so they were originally from the continent of Europe, specifically a place known as Scandinavia, which is the Norway, Sweden, Denmark area. And we talked about the fact that Viking, the root word Vik, means pirate. And that's exactly how the Vikings behaved. Knowing how to sail ships, they basically took their ships and they sailed from coast to coast to coast all throughout Europe and invaded cities and towns and stole and pillaged. And so that's where they got the name Viking from. We talked about the fact that eventually, about 1,000 years ago, the Vikings left Europe and they sailed into the unknown ocean, something that really no one had ever done before. Remember, this is 500 years before Columbus. And the Vikings sailed to the west and they hit land. And when they got here, it was it was cold, but it was beautiful and green vegetation, lush vegetation. So naturally, they called this green island Iceland. Story says they named it something gross like Iceland so that no one would come and take their land because it sounded like a place no one would want to be. We talked about the fact that the head Viking, Eric the Red, was exiled. He was forced to leave Iceland for 3 years for murdering his neighbor. And so he and his family traveled on and eventually hit another island. This one, super cold, super icy. So, of course, they're going to name it Greenland. Now, Greenland is where Eric the Red and his family are going to stay for the 3 years they're not allowed in Iceland. But Greenland doesn't have any food. So it became the job of Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, to go off in search of food. And so he set sail yet again, continued to sail west into the unknown, where he hit land. He hit what is today Canada. Today, this part in Canada is called Newfoundland, Canada, Newfoundland. But he didn't call it Newfoundland. Leif Erikson called it Vinland because it was filled with vines and vines of grapes, great for making wine. Vinland turned out to be an amazing place for hunting and fishing. And so Leif Erikson would lead trips every few months to Vinland to get enough food to bring back to Greenland for the Vikings. If you guys remember, you acted out the story of Greenlander's saga. This was the story of when Leif Erikson could not go to Vinland. Instead, his brother Thorvald went in his place, and Thorvald encountered Native Americans, and they had a battle. During the battle, Thorvald was stabbed in the stomach by a spear. They tried to get him back to the safety of Greenland, but Leif Erikson's brother Thorvald died of his wounds, and the Vikings never returned to Vinland again. And that is the story of why the Vikings' trips to North America ended. And that was where we ended chapter 2.5, learning about the Vikings.